Estelle West, and I'm 92. I think we went to the pumping station in about 1943, I think. The end of 1942. I know it was after Japan entered the war that we went there, because on the pumping stations, when Japan entered the war, especially at Cunderdin because of the aerodrome, they had men patrolling the pumping station and the dams 24 hours a day. So there were 3 men walking around with a gun on their shoulder 24 hours a day, like 1 8-hour shifts. That wasn't long before we left Cunderdin, so yes. And of course we weren't allowed to go out to the airport, which the town were out there often. There was things going on all the time, especially for children, you know, parties, and that all stopped, of course, because we weren't allowed to go out there once Japan entered the war. So that's when we moved up to number 5. Well, when I look back, it wasn't too bad, but at the time, I suppose we weren't that old. I was in about my second last year at school. So by the time we went to school and done our homework, and because everything was all new up there, it was all built in the scrub. So everywhere, apart from the pump and that, when we looked out, all you could see for miles and miles was scrub. But this time of the year, when all the flowers were out, we used to hop on our bikes and we'd ride round and round and see what we could find different, you know. And so we found things to do, but it was a bit difficult to start with because the school was very small. Just had 1 teacher. But fortunately for me, we had lovely teachers. Old retired ones come back to work because of the war. And somehow to me, when I look around today, those older teachers were far better. You know, they had, besides schoolwork, we had a Mrs. Moritz. She'd come from down at Mount Barker Way, and she was retired and come back to work. And she was pretty bright and with it. And then we had a Mrs. Powell from Morawar, and she was very clever with her fingers, you know, knitting and sewing and fancy working. So she got the whole school on these things. Even the boys, they were doing fancy work, and the boy pennies of all people, and there were 5 of them, I think, and they were all doing fancy work. And then, of course, we'd take it home, and then we started buying, you know, printed things to work at home. And so it was really, you know, she taught them how to crochet and knit and all sorts of things. And whether they ever carried it on, I don't know. But they lived in, you know, a little house alongside the school, so they had plenty of time because there wasn't anything much for them to do. And of course we had the annual sports, which was between Westonia and Burracoppin and Bedallin, I think. And we'd go to a different place. They didn't come to the pump because there was no facilities there, but we went to those places every year and had the sports carnival. And as I said, we actually win it one year, just with a few kids. I think there were 8 kids or 9 kids at school. He was a fireman. So they did 3 8-hour shifts, like one, there was 3 of them, did 8 hours, 7 days a week. And the whole time they were there, the 8 hours, they were loading the fires up to make the steam, to work the engines. And so they did that for 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. And after about 6 months, they'd give them a couple of days off. But they never had weekends or anything off, and it was very, you know, they were 6-foot logs, and they had to be about that big around. And that's all they did most of the day. They'd be doing that probably every hour or so during their shift, be loading up these, there were 4 great big burning things, and they were loading them up all the time. That was their job. The carters brought it in, people were cutting it, and the baronas and that were buying it off these people that were living out in the bush cutting wood. And as I say, it had to be 6 foot long, and, you know, there was nothing any bigger than sort of about that. So if it was bigger than that, the tree, they had to split it, and so the Baronas had a couple of trucks, and they were bringing it in right opposite the big furnaces, and so the men had lifted off the heap and into the fire, but it was heavy work. There were 8 houses there. A couple had been built in recent times, just before we went there, but we were in one of the old originals, and most of the people were in the old originals. Like, there was engineers, and then there was an engineer in charge. He ran the show, and so I think there was 3 engineers, and they went to work with the men. They worked 8-hour shifts too, and I think there was a couple of greasers. I think they just went around greasing the engines, and there was 2 great big dams there, which were always full of water. But I was thinking this morning, every year the dams had to be cleaned out, so the water supply men from Merredin and Burracoppin, I think, would come up for the day and bring all these wheelbarrows, and they'd make sure the 2 dams were pumped all out towards Southern Cross, and they cleaned the dams all day with a brush, big brush thing on a stick, and these wheelbarrows, and they wheeled the wheelbarrows up the dam wall, and it was a very big, deep dam, and wheeled them over to the bush where there was a wet area there. They tipped all the sludge there. And the men that worked on the pump, and these men from the water supply, they did that. And they had to do it in a day because they couldn't leave the pump without water. So every year they did that. And it was just this black sludge all in the bottom of the dam. And I used to think, oh, goodness me, the wheeling it up from the bottom of the dam up to the top and then over there, that was, the dam would have been as deep as this house, like. The man from Walgoolan, the shop at Walgoolan, he used to come up once a week in a sort of a ute type thing, and he had a whole lot of groceries and that on the back, and you bought what you needed, like, he didn't carry fresh milk, but he did carry butter, and he didn't carry anything much else except tins of stuff and, that. And of course we didn't need any veggies because we grew all our own. Dad was a very keen gardener, and we hadn't been there that long before he had everything growing, and all the old trees that were planted when the pump was first built. Of course they were all in a bad show as well. Nobody had been looking after them, and of course they were this big around even then. And anyway, he got to them, and because he was a gardener and he'd pruned things, and he got them all cut back and everything, and after a couple of years we had so much fruit and stuff we did. Well, people used to come there from out of town and out of the farms. They'd come and get pears and oranges and apricots and figs and plums, and then of course he planted a whole lot more. Then these old grapevines, was a big long thing of those, of some of the original old grapes. And so he got all those all pruned and all growing and everything. And so after a year or so, there was grapes everywhere and beautiful names that you never hear today, like they were ones that had been imported here, I think. But it was a shame because when the pump closed down, the bulldozers just came in, evidently, and they pushed all those old trees. And if they'd have just kept them going, and someone had gone and pruned them every year, people could have gone there from on the farms and that, and done all their peaches and stuff for bottling, but they didn't. They pushed them all over with the thing and pushed them all up in big heaps, which the last time I was there the heaps were still there. They never ever cleaned it up or tidied it up. Mum used to come down nearly every Friday, because by this time both sisters were in Merredin living. No, we had to come on a goods train. We had to be up at the siding at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Friday, and then wait for the train to come, and sometimes it was an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. But we had to wait, and then you had to go out and stand on the line and stop it, get the driver to stop. And it was the same with the Kalgoorlie Express, so that if we wanted to get on that at night, we had to take a lantern up and be there at the time it was due, and it wasn't ever on time, of course. And when we heard it coming around the bend up the top of the hill, we had to go out in the middle of the line and wave the lantern to get it to stop for us to go. So if we were going to go to Perth or anywhere, that's what we would have to go on. But every Friday morning there was this goods train, and it had, at the back of the guards van, there was a couple of little where you could sit. And most Fridays someone went on the train. Not everyone used it, but Mum used to go usually most Fridays. Yes, occasionally, but you see, we had school, so we couldn't really go. I mean, you wouldn't want too many kids to stop away from school when there's only 8 or 9 in school. But but the school was marvellous. We had lots of different teachers. We had those 2 older women during the war. Now, when the war finished, of course, the younger, newer teachers were all coming on then, so we got Honor O'Hare from Cunderdin, and when I was reading lots of historical books about all round Cunderdin and all round everywhere, Meckering and that, she was at all of those, one teacher schools during her teaching career. She came to the pump, and then we had Mr. Elms. His father was the Uniting Church minister in Merredin. He and his wife were there, and then, there were quite a lot of other, Mrs. Price from Bedellin, the boy Price's, their mother. And I'll never forget her, because on the days when they were supposed to pick her up every Friday to take her back to the farm to do the washing and cooking and what have you, they would get stuck at Carabin and wouldn't get back to pick her up. So if they hadn't arrived to pick her up by about 5 o'clock, she would walk up the pipeline to Bedellin and wait there, and she'd wait for someone to be going out their way to the farm. I don't know how far out of town they were, but her husband was on the farm. But the boys used to be shearers, and they would be going home every Friday night. But of course they forgot about Mum most weeks. And she didn't want to walk up the main highway because she thought that might be a bit dangerous. So she walked up the pipeline, which is a dirt track, And she was a very able-bodied lady. She worked until she was really quite old, Wonderful teachers, because they had all the original ways of doing things. Once they started getting newer teachers, then the whole thing changed around, and I suppose as kids, the freedom, I mean, you could go wherever you liked on your bikes or walk or, there was lots of things to see, lots of, as I say, wildflowers and orchids and in the bush there was like kangaroos and then of course we could build a cubby in the bush as well, which we loved doing, and, build it all up and sort of play there and, my mother was very fussy and very particular, so everything had to be done properly, and quite often have to go back and do it again. She used to do the washing, but my sister and I had to do the ironing with flat irons on the wood stove. We didn't have any power. We had kerosene lamps and things. And I suppose by the time we'd done the things that we had to do, sweeping and raking up the leaves and And sometimes as we got a bit older, we'd be probably doing a bit of cooking as well. And then she got not very well in later years, and so we were sort of doing everything. Although my sister, younger than me, she had come to Merredin and she was working at the commercial, and my other sister had married and she was living in Merredin, so there was really only two of us home to do it. But and as my mother wasn't that well, which I used to blame the doctors for, because she would come into town and she wouldn't be very well, and Dr. Byron said, oh no, she'd be all right. And in later years I realised that if he'd have done the right thing by her early on, she wouldn't have probably had the later problems that she had. But after I, in my middle age, had a hysterectomy, and I realised that if she had have had that hysterectomy, when doctor said, you know, she needed to have it, but he didn't want to do it. I don't know why, but he didn't. And he kept putting her off and putting her off. Whereas the doctor that I went to, well, it was the cancer people in Kings Park originally. I used to go every year to have a cancer check. And after a couple of years, the fellow in the cancer place said to me, look, you've been coming here for years, and every year you've got the same thing wrong with you. You can't keep on like this, you've got to have something done. And he said, I'm not supposed to give advice to you. He said, I'm only here to test and do things. But he said, I'm going to break the rules, and I'm going to write to your doctor in Merredin and tell him what I've found and tell him he has to do something, which he did. And I don't think he ever got into trouble for it. But I often wonder if doctor had have acted, you know, on his prognosis back then, if she may not have ended up with the cancer and that, because they might have found it like earlier, sort of. But yes, once she wasn't very well, she just didn't do anything at all. And so we really, and she didn't want me to ever go anywhere or go away, so I couldn't go anywhere. She wouldn't let me get a job or do anything. 14, I started doing correspondence, you know, because once I got out of year 6, and then I started doing correspondence, but it was impossible to do it because she wanted you to do all these things, and I found that because I was sitting home all day, she didn't think you had to sit and look at your paper and work it all out and do your schoolwork. She thought it was like homework type thing. So I couldn't really continue doing the correspondence because I didn't have the time to sit and do it. And she didn't like us reading books. She used to say that was a waste of time. So any books that we had, we would hide under our bed or something like that, and then when we went to bed at night with the lantern, we would read. And if she came and caught us, you know, she'd take the book away from us. She didn't think people should read, because she never went to school, so she never knew that. And it's funny because my sister said, she was telling me a few years ago, she said, oh, she's sitting in the lounge reading a book and someone rings the doorbell. She shoves the book under the lounge because she's so, you know, we were so used to getting rid of the book. And she said she still does it today. But it's funny, isn't it, how, like, and I love to read because originally my first school teacher that I had in Northam, before we left Northam, she was most keen about reading and writing and arithmetic. And as long as you did those well, in her eyes, you were great. And she really concentrated on kids and made sure, you know, they did that. And so I often think when I sit down to read now, you know, she probably wouldn't like it. But I've always loved reading and especially historical things, you know, I've always... And Fred next door to me, like he brings me home books from the Petticoat Lane, and quite often I go out the front and there's 2 or 3 books on the front thing. Sometimes I'm sure they have never been read by the people that had them, because there's no marks on them, and sometimes there's a name in them, that they've been given, but they're beautiful. Yes. I went to the farm at Noongar for a few months. My in-laws went away for a couple of months' holiday to Perth because they hadn't been able to go up until that time. And so when they came back off this holiday, they said to us, look, we're going to sell the farm, you'll have to get another job, At Bedellen at the dance, well, they were wonderful, yes. And we used to have Teddy Pick and Mrs. Can't think of her name now. She used to play the piano, and Teddy used to play about 5 instruments, different instruments. And they used to go to all those dances, like Walgirl and Westonia, Bedellen. And so they took it in turns on a Saturday night. It was at one of those places on a Saturday night with all our finery in the back of a truck. Mr. Rose, who's last's father in Bedellen, he used to pick us up when he was going to Walgirl or Westonia, and when we were going to Bedellen, some friends of mine lived out on a farm just out from Carrabin, so they used to pick us up and take us to Bedellen. They had a couple of girls that liked dancing, and but we used to go on the back. They only had a little truck, and we'd go on the back of the truck, sit on the back of the truck. I did go to work for the parents at Westonia for about, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 months. They had a cafe opposite the hall in Westonia, and I went there and worked for them. And then after that, they decided to sell when the mine was going to close and everything back then. They decided to sell and go to Perth. So since my mother wouldn't allow me to go to Perth, of course, so I went home then, and I never had a job after that, no. It was one of those dances where you change partner every time. I think it was the barn dance, I think. And I had never seen him up until that time, but of course he and his mum and dad were in the army. Well, he was in the Air Force and mum and dad were in the army. And she was at Nungarran for many years, looking after all those girls out there. And he was in the army. He didn't go overseas, but he was in the offices and that, because he'd been in the First World War. And so they wanted to sell the farm and said to us, so my husband had put in for a war service land settlement place after the war, thinking, he'd get one around that area, but of course he didn't. But the people in the office in Perth said, look, we're just breaking up a farm up at Carnamah now into 20 farms. If you would like a job and your wife, you can go up there, and that will help you probably to get a farm quicker, get a block quicker. You might even get one of those blocks, they said. So that's where we went. I was cooking for the men that were working there. It was a huge place. It belonged to Levy, and he had a great big thing where the men lived, and then he had a big kitchen and another little sort of a flat thing where we lived, and he had chooks and all those sorts of things. So, so I had to cook for the men, and I got paid for that, and he had to work on the farm. So, so we did that for quite a few years, and I quite enjoyed it. I was supposed to cook for 8 people, but there was never less than, I don't know how many, especially when all the people came up from Perth, all the officials had come up every now and again to have a look and see how it was all going, because it was a huge, big farm, and of course they were farming it while they were breaking it up. And I think there were 8 different parts of the farm, and there were 8 houses and sheds, and because he built everything so big, when I saw these posts that the telephone people are doing, the light people are doing in the street, when I saw those posts, that round, that's what he had in his sheds and everything. He built everything so big, and he had 8 sheds and houses built around the farm. It was so big. And he had, when in the working days, he had people in there too, in his working days. But when they broke the farms up, of course, the people who got that block moved into the sheds and houses, but it was huge. And but we never got one anyway, so I don't know. They don't tell you why you don't get one. They said there were lots of people, in for them, of course, because it's a wonderful growing area and, you couldn't go wrong. But a lot of the people who had been share farming around that area and even on those blocks, a lot of those got farms. But the sad thing about it was that only 2 or 3 or 4 years after they got the farms, they sold them. Of course, they were worth, millions, and they had no trouble selling them. And it seemed a shame because they hadn't put any restrictions on them, that they had to, once they had paid them back, which they would have done after a couple of years with the way the crops and that were there. And it was about halfway between Carnamah and Bunjil, which was a little siding over on the other railway line. And because they had no trouble selling them or anything. So, yeah, we moved off and went to work for some farmers that were just outside of that block of land, and we were there for a good few years. Oh, I suppose because my husband I sort of wanted to come back because, all my family were up this way, and by this time we had 2 children, and he said, we came back here, he'd get a job in the railways, because he'd started in the railways in the original days before he went home on the farm during the war, and so back we came, and he got a job on the railways, and we got a house, and so it was good from there. I got a job and in Gribbles, and kids were all going to school. The two of them were going to school. I had another baby, and as soon as she was like school age, I was cleaning the South Merredin school even before, because she could come to work with me when I went in the afternoon. She would come and be writing on the things, sitting at the desk writing and that. So I did that for quite a few years, and then when she started school, I went to the high school cleaning the place up there. Because at South Merredin, I was the only one there cleaning the whole school. Anyway, the education department came up and, had a big thing around all the schools and everything. And so after they went back to Perth, we got a letter to say that I could no longer do it on my own. I had to have help. It's funny, after all those years. But it didn't matter, because I lived just down the road, and it meant that what I didn't get done, on Saturday, I'd go up and polish the room where the teachers had their lunch and everything. So I'd keep all the school part right, but I'd go back and do the office and where the schoolroom was, where the teachers used to be, and I could go back and polish that on, because have a key. And it was very interesting, yes. Well, I suppose it's what's in this book about all these things starting up. Of course, most of the buildings were up, but a lot of the shops were changing, like butchers, and were all changing over. I think at one stage we had 3 or 4 butchers in town, and we had like 2 or 3 places where you could buy clothes, and of course there was Mr. Holmeston where you could buy shoes, and there seemed to be most things, you know, that you needed you could get in Merredin. Like I don't think it started going downhill until I don't know when, must have been years later. When I look now, it's sad because, especially with this book, they've got all the photos of all the street and everything and all the people's names, and when you see them up there and you think, oh, you know, yes, it was. I think probably all started probably after the war, I would have thought. After the, what, about 1945, I think, wasn't it? And I think, but there were lots of things happening in town, so it was good because there were lots of things you could be interested in. Like, we started thinking about building the senior centre to start with, and so that was great because that took up a lot of time, and there were lots of things to be involved in, lots of things at the church and Sunday school, and they just seemed to be lots and lots of things. We did, yes. We shifted from the one that we had in Core Street, and my husband was still working on the railways, and that was quite a strange thing because this was in Throstle Road opposite the pool, by the pool there. And this house was up for sale, and I thought, oh, that looks a lovely house. And we decided that we'd buy a house somewhere in town, and I'd been to a couple of the agents and, you know, found out about various things. And we were still sort of thinking about it, and at this stage I was working at Gribble's running the deli, and anyway, this fellow came up one morning and sort of asked him what he would like, and he said, oh, I've actually come to see you. He said, I believe you're wanting to buy a house in Merredin. And I said, oh, yes. He said, oh, well, I'm from the Commonwealth Bank. And I said, oh, well, you can't do much. You can't help us. He said, oh, how do you know? I said, oh, well, you know, usually you've got to have a big deposit and, you know, all that thing, big repayments. And he said, oh, of course I can help you. He said, as a matter of fact, he said, we've got a house at the moment that we're selling up because the fellow had gone bankrupt. And we heard that you were wanting to buy a house. He said, and thought you might be interested. Now I said, oh, I don't think you could do much for us. He said, oh, well, look, I'll tell you what, why don't you come down and see us and see what we can do for you? So I said to my husband that he banked Commonwealth, but I banked in New South Wales. So when I went home and I said to him, and he said, it's a waste of time. You know, he said, you know, they want a big deposit and big repayments, and, you know, we probably wouldn't be able to manage it. And I said, well, let's go and see. So we did. Well, we came out of there, you know, he almost sort of said, you know, you've got to buy it. And he said, you know, it's, even though the interest on your money in those days that you had to pay was 17%, you know, on what you borrowed. But he said to us, he said, well, look, we only want $200 deposit and $20 a week repayment. And he said, and I'll tell you what, I'll get you the $20. He said, I've got a friend who's looking for board. He said, so you can have a boarder for $20 a week, and there you are, you paid for your house. I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. I thought I would never have heard a bank. But you see, this fellow had gone bankrupt, and I suppose they thought, well, they're better off to get something from the house. And anyway, it was lovely because, you know, after we sort of got it paid off and we did it all, you know, did it up and looked after it, and I had a lovely garden and everything, and it was really lovely, and, you know, had lots of rooms. So it meant then that I had this boarder fellow, and then after he went, I could have another fellow. He was working somewhere in town, and, you know, they couldn't find anywhere to live. And so it was really great because, you know, they were away all day. They'd have their breakfast and then they'd go, and so I worked a couple more times at Gribbles, but then I left there because I thought, well, I don't really need to go to work now. And my two older children, or Wendy wanted to be a nurse, so we got her organised at Fremantle to do her training, and Rob wanted to go to Merredin, so we'd organised that. And so we were able to keep them there, although Wendy got paid. Those were the days when they did a little bit of work and they got paid and they had accommodation by the hospital. And so she could manage quite well without us. You know, she didn't need any help. But Rob had to pay for him at Merredin. But then when he left Merredin, he got a job sort of on a farm, so, you know, that was good. And Pam was still sort of at school. She was at high school. But, yeah, so it was really marvellous, you know. I never ever got over that fellow. I remember just after he'd been and gone away, and I was still sort of thinking, you know, this can't be true. Doug Good, who was our minister at the time, that was his day to be over from Bruce Rock, and he always used to pop in and say hello to me, you know, at the deli, and I said, oh, guess what's just happened to me? And I told him about this bank, and I said, I can't believe it. And he said, oh, that's great. And of course I was only about 3 doors from the church, and it was just wonderful because it meant then I could look after the lawns and water them and mow them, and yeah, it was really wonderful. And of course, when my mother-in-law got to the stage in Perth where she could no longer look after herself, she said she'd like to come back to Merredin and live. So I said, oh, well, so we built a flat in the backyard, and or had it built, and she came back there, but she was only there for about a year and a half where she was able to live in the flat, and she ended up in hospital being looked after. But it was wonderful, really, because it sort of everything seemed to work out. And then while we were there, then when I finished working at Gribbles, Lorna Robertson asked me to go into partnership with her in the coffee lounge. I used to go and give her a hand. I knew her, and she used to, when she was really busy, you know, on pig sale day and that, she'd say, you know, could I come and give her a bit of a hand over lunch, because she was very busy, because all the girls from the shops and the banks and that used to come there for lunch. So she'd had it a few years and she was getting really tired, and she said if she didn't get someone in to, you know, give her a hand. So she asked me if I'd like to go in with her. She didn't want any ingoing money or anything. Just go in and work and cook and, you know, do all our own stuff. And and the pay was, if we got a $50 note through the week, that was the only pay that we took. So if we got 1 or 2 or 3, we split it between the two of us. We didn't actually take any pay out of the shop. But it was marvellous. We were run off our feet, you know, because I was doing the sponges and the cheesecakes and things like that, and she was making lamingtons. And every morning when we went to work, we'd take it in turns making a batch of scones, so people would have scones for morning tea. And it worked out marvellously, you know. Educating my children, I think, because I wanted to be a school teacher, but of course there was no way that I could ever attain to any of that. And the one thing that I always said was, if I ever had children, I would make sure they had an education. And I determined that even if I worked night and day, they would have an education and they would do what they wanted to do, and they did, because Wendy wanted to be a nurse and Rob wanted to be a farmer, and I knew that he would never own a farm, but that's why I said to him, well, it's no use, you've got to do something so that you aren't dependent on that. You can do farm things, but you don't have to be a farmer. And then Pam comes along and she wants to be involved in politics, of all things. Not particularly being a member, but she wanted to be involved in the parliament. So that meant she had to go to uni. So I had to educate the three of them, which I managed okay. And Pam went to uni and they all did so well. Pam got a special mention at a graduation thing. And she went immediately then to work for Bill Hassel, who was a member in Perth. And she worked for him until, well, even after she got married, she went back and she worked in his office. And she did all his checking up and everything. And when she was leaving to, by this time she'd had a baby, got married and had a baby. And when she was leaving him to go home because the little boy was, growing up, he was very sad and sorry, and he just said he didn't know what he was going to do without her, because she just did everything for him, researched everything. And so they all were so successful that I felt that anything that I had done really was a real blessing, and I was so glad that I was able to do. And of course there was plenty of work around then. I mean, it was before the days of when all the tills and everything all changed over. It was just, that's when I finished, when they all started changing and they stopped selling stuff over the counter and it was all done up in packets, and, when that all altered. But up until that time, there was plenty of work in town. I mean, there were numerous places wanted people to work, but yes, we loved it at Gribbles. There was, it was really great. But yes, I think just being able to educate my children, not having been able to have an education myself, I felt like I'd achieved something without having to go and borrow money at the bank, never sort of had to go into debt. And of course we got the house paid off in Trossel Road, and it was a lovely position there. I was at the pool and Bowling Green was there then. It's a mess now, I have to say. And the fellow that bought it, the house, he just about destroyed the place doing it up, he reckoned, and he's still doing it up. But he let all the garden die. And in fact, Sue Riley next door, she said to me, she rang me up down at Merredin one day and she said, he's taking all the roses and everything out, she said. Do you want me to bring them down to you? And I said no, because we're not allowed to have a garden. They do the gardening. And she said, well, do you mind if I have them? I said, no. And she said, oh, well, when he digs them up, I'll get him to throw them over my fence.